Let me shift over to the president's inaugural address because you and I both watched it. I was there, although I was there in an exclusive seat, basically stuck behind the porta potties watching a jumbotron. You had a much better view. But what did you think of the president's speech?
Well, we should clarify my much better view was from my couch watching on TV, which was warmer, although I think there's a value to being there. So even if you were behind the Jumbotron and freezing, I'm a little envious. I loved the speech. I know I wrote a pretty, glowing review of it. And I don't always say that about the president's speeches. I thought his first inaugural address was rhetorical, as a writer. I didn't think it was a great piece of writing. It didn't have a theme. It didn't really make, and then didn't make a really clear argument. And then substantively, this is the part of the side of Barack Obama that I know a lot of other people like least, which is this. We're gonna get past partisan. It was all about getting past partisan differences, bringing the country together. In principle, I think that's a wonderful notion. In practice, I think it was both ill-suited for the situation. I think at that point in time we needed a speech about where really more, not so much about how we were going to work as a political system, but what kind of country he wanted to create. I didn't think it had enough of that emphasis. And also, as we saw in the first term, particularly those first 2 years, the whole way, he was dealing with an opposition that wasn't willing to play ball. So it was a particularly ill-timed. I think it looked not that great at the time. In retrospect, if you go back and read that speech, it really just feels like not a great, just it didn't work. I thought this speech was the opposite. Rhetorically, as a piece of writing, it had a very clear, coherent message. It had an argument, and it was an argument that I found, I thought was much better suited to the time, and it really, it was a profoundly, it was an ideological speech. It was a philosophical speech. I mean, this was, and as I said at the time, it was important not just for what it told us about where President Obama sees us going in the next 4 years, really for to read, looking back at the last 4 years, like here's what I did, and here's why I did it. This, these laws that I fought for, these ideas, not just healthcare reform, but financial reform, the Recovery Act, saving the auto industry. Um, uh, uh, these were not just, a patchwork of ideas. These were part of a coherent effort to create an America in which, when we are vulnerable, when we are insecure, when we face crisis, we band together, and we help each other. We're part of one country. And it's interesting. When you think about it, I think there's a common thread to that, to his first inaugural, and this idea that he has about bringing people together. But it's bringing people together for the sake of mutual protection. In policy terms, for the issues you and I deal with, we think of it in terms of social insurance. Everybody pays into Medicare, so everyone has insurance when they retire. Same with Social Security, same with Obamacare. But it's much broader than that. And I thought it was highly significant, that he managed to link that to the remarkable strides he's taken on things like same-sex marriage. The invocation of Stonewall and Selma together. And to me, it was more powerful, and it was really about, this is the America I want to have. This is the America I've been trying to create. And I think in that sense, it was similar. It rose to the level of, say, of the addresses we remember from Franklin Roosevelt, from Ronald Reagan. But of course, it was much thematically. In some ways, I think it was very much, if you think of a pendulum, where Roosevelt was sort of on one end of a sort of a more liberal vision, and Reagan was a more conservative vision. This was sort of saying, we're done with the Reagan Revolution. We're done with that. Reagan defined a certain time. Well, we're defining a new time. When it's not horrible to say that, government can do some good. We have plenty of times we want it to come together as a way not to help us, but for us to help ourselves.
It's funny. I took my daughter to the inauguration, and actually the night before we went to the Lincoln Memorial, and which is really sort of the temple of American democracy. And it was we walked around the mall a little bit, and to be with the crowd of people who were just jammed into the inaugural. None of us could see, but people. It was regular people of every shape, size, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, handedness, whatever. I mean, you really got a sense this is the America we are becoming, and a lot of people who basically felt like guests in our own country felt, this is actually, we're not guests anymore in the same way. And to see the president present this dual message of social protection and social inclusion was something that was just really powerful. And it's funny, the 2012 election on the surface was really a terrible policy debate on a bunch of stuff. I didn't learn anything listening to the two candidates on the surface debate stuff, but it ended up actually being about deep stuff because it really forced people, especially after the president blew the first debate. In some ways, I think actually it became sweeter after that because I still am baffled that he did so badly in that debate. But a lot of people from all sorts of different walks of life said, "Oh my God, he actually might lose this thing," and actually got in and started to try to help. And it ended up being about the things that you just identified. And this election act ended up, especially with the 47% comment and other things, and the attacks on Obamacare. And I think that when health reform was debated, we all got so wonky about it because we kind of had to, because it's complicated and you have to talk about what is a health insurance exchange, how does Medicaid work, how can you keep your insurance, all the 2,000 pages of the thing. You kind of have to get into the weeds, but you lose that broader thread of we're trying to protect each other against these risks that would just crush any one of us if we had to face it on our own. And then all of a sudden, this election, Mitt Romney presents this real contrast to that. And of course, multi layers of irony there because he's the architect of Obamacare in Massachusetts. And it ended up being a really significant election. Now, it's still, unlike President Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson in his 1964, of course, President Obama still has Republicans in the House who basically have an incentive to kind of burn the House down on health reform. But he's also got these Republican governors who need to make it work, that he might potentially be able to work with. And so we'll sort of see how this goes. Any last words of wisdom for us before I sign us off?
No, no last words of wisdom. I know you had mentioned, you want to talk a little bit about what your hopes and fears for the year are in
Yes. What are your hopes
2013,
and fears for
and
the year?
and putting aside healthcare reform, which I think is going to continue to be a huge story, and you and I will be following, and I'm thankful for the many people covering this much more intensely than I am at this point. There's some terrific reporters out there. You and I don't know who they are, and follow our Twitter feeds, and you'll see us link to them all the time. And it's actually, I was thinking about this the other day. It's a much harder story to cover now. Difficult. I mean, as complicated and intense as it was when we were passing and defending law, it was always a one-place story. It was a Washington story. It was in Congress. It was in the Supreme Court. This is now 50 different stories, or 51 because you're still covering the Washington story, and it's sprawling, and it's stuff every day. And it's just last week there were 3 separate major developments. I mean, the administration announced a new sort of fine-tuning of the regulation on contraception, what coverage we provided. There was a ruling about affordability, which is one of those words that no one understands until you tell them. It means who gets tax credits and who doesn't to help them pay for insurance when they don't get it from their employers. And that was a big deal. I just read about that today. And then, on top of that, you had what was happening in the states. In various states saying they would do this, that, and this is a massive, sprawling story. But putting that aside, I am hopeful that we can get a little bit past, not that far past, I feel like it's been this one incredibly intense conflict that almost without a break. It's been not a series of skirmishes. It's been a war with battles that just never seems to end. And I'm not naive about this. I think, I'm not naive about this. The Republicans and Democrats are going to continue the debate strong, and this will define what we can and can't do. I also am not one of those people who thinks that's necessarily a bad thing. We have strong points of view here. We should debate them. It's good to have these arguments. And if sometimes that means we don't get stuff done, well, sometimes that's okay. There are things we need to get done, like lifting the debt ceiling. But this is our country. But I am hopeful that we can, maybe get away and do a little more thinking about some other issues. I mean, I'm sort of looking forward. I'm enjoying the fact that we're talking about immigration and guns right now, which are mostly removed substantively, thematically from what we've been debating for the last few years. I'm hoping to look forward to some more writing and reading, in coming months about things like climate change. Oh my God, we really need to deal with that. And, work family issues and more, foreign policy that gets past the old, who are we going to bomb tomorrow debate. So I'm hopeful that the next year, the next 2 years, can be a little more variety. I guess is what I'm looking for. I like variety.
Is it, by the way, you mentioned immigration, and I get hopeful, partly because Mitt Romney self-deported in the election. I think is sort of my basic verdict. I think his decision to move right on immigration basically doomed him. And I think every Republican understands the demographic trend, and it's amazing what a difference that's made after the election. The Republican Party clearly needs to do something about immigration, and as a health policy matter, that's critically important because we have all of these unauthorized residents and legal immigrants who are a serious chunk of the health policy problem, actually, especially in a city like Chicago, where we have this huge flow from Mexico. Uh, and essentially, we couldn't do anything about that as a health policy matter until the immigration issues were settled. And I think actually, as the immigration issue is settled, it will actually have a tremendous ripple effect in health policy. Uh, Climate change, I think, I'm much more pessimistic about because all of the institutional pathologies we saw in healthcare will apply to an even greater extent in climate change. And I also think any president who looks at what President Obama went through on healthcare is going to look at if you say, do you want to stake your presidency on a climate change bill? And here President Obama actually passed health reform, and it didn't seem to do him a lot of good, at least so far. And I worry we're going to have a kind of Vietnam syndrome with presidents looking at our dysfunctional Congress and just saying, I cannot do something that big because I just can't afford to. I want some variety myself in the issues that I push, and sort of staking my political survival on 60 votes in the United States Senate is just not where any president's going to ever want to be again. So,
Yep.
so on that heavily pessimistic note, I'm going to shut us down. Let's see if this works.